Yeah, so in this presentation, first I'll give you a little bit of background about myself because I think there are a lot of different ways to think about soil, and it's important to know where the person providing the information is coming from. And then we'll get into some key soil properties and their relevance to food production. And then I'll talk about restoration techniques and how to measure and conserve soil. So I just started a new job 2 weeks ago. I'm now the UNBC compost operator, which is exciting. I wear a few hats right now. I'm also working on finishing a master's at UNBC in biology. My research is about mushroom cultivation using crop wastes. And I am also a part-time vegetable grower with 3 Seeds Farm. I have a bachelor's in forest management and ecology with a minor in soils and the environment. So that's where a lot of my academic knowledge of soils comes from. I have TA'd Introduction to Soil Science a few times at UNBC, and last year for 8 months I was working in Beaver Lodge, Alberta as a soil health technician for Agriculture and Canada. So before we get into all of the different soil properties, I think it's important to think about how we think about soil. So the traditional textbook definition, well, the formatting got changed, some of the text may be here, but the traditional definition of soil is to think of it as a collection of stuff. So collection of air, water, mineral particles, organic matter, and soil organisms. And it is a collection of stuff, but increasingly we are moving towards thinking of soil as an ecosystem, as a space that contains many different types of microhabitats and thousands of different types of soil bacteria, fungi, protists, insects, worms, nematodes, and more. And that's sort of the perspective that I want to emphasize today. All right, so I'm going to go over some soil properties. Depending on people's level of familiarity, it might seem like a really basic review, or it might seem like a lot of information all at once, but I've tried to kind of keep it as relevant and accessible as possible.
Is it possible to sharpen it? It's just the words in that one on the left. Yeah.
It was, yeah. It's an improvement, but
it wasn't. You passed it. There it is.
Yeah. Okay.
I think it's also the thing we need. That's way better.
Sweet.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you've been gardening for a while, you're probably familiar with soil texture, which is the composition of the soil in terms of the 3 size classes of mineral particles. The biggest being sand, next being silt, and then the tiny particles of clay. And so your soil composition in terms of texture tells you a few things about what the soil is going to be like. It tells you how easy it is going to be to work the soil. Of course, clay has a bad reputation for being really challenging to work with, heavy, sticky. It also tells you about your vulnerability to compaction, because if you have a soil that is made of all these really, really tiny clay particles, the pore spaces between them are also going to be very tiny. And so if you squish that, it's really difficult to undo. Soil texture also tells you about water retention and availability and nutrient retention and availability. And so clay gets a bad rap, but every soil texture has its pros and cons. Clay is better at holding on to water and nutrients because of its cation exchange capacity, which I won't have time to quite get into today. But ability to retain water and nutrients is not necessarily ability to provide those things to your plants, because they have to also be able to access that in the soil. And that's why loam is sort of the prized, well-rounded soil that everyone wants, because it's a mix of these 3 different types of particles, and you get the best of all worlds. You get a soil that has a mix of different pore sizes, it has some cohesion, it's able to retain water and nutrients, but it's also loose enough that you can work it, your plant roots and the water can infiltrate, and you have sort of a balance of these different elements. Building on soil texture, we have soil structure, which is sort of the larger blocks or shapes that the soil particles form together. And a structured soil is more desirable than an unstructured soil. So there are two types of unstructured soil that are sort of on opposite poles. On the one hand, you have massive, which is like, if you imagine just like a block of clay that you would buy at a craft store. It's just sort of like even composition. It's really uniform. It's really difficult for water to infiltrate, for roots to get in there. And then on the other end of the unstructured spectrum, you have single grain, which would be like a really, really sandy soil. So there's nothing holding the particles together. They can erode, they can be blown away in the wind. Water infiltrates, but it almost infiltrates too quickly. It just drops way down into the soil profile. So those two are not ideal. They're relatively rare though, because most soils are a mix of different particle sizes. When I've taught Introduction to Soil Science, a common source of confusion is the difference between granular and single grain. So single grain is like a pure sand, not desirable. Granular is actually a really nice soil structure. If you've ever seen worm castings, those little crumbs that they leave, that's granular. So it's kind of like this crumb structure where you usually have particles coated in organic matter, and that again, it creates larger pore spaces, but it also creates cohesion between the particles because the organic matter is kind of sticky, right? So then you get a soil that is relatively low density, roots can get in, water can get in, but it also is sticking together, which makes it less vulnerable to erosion. And similarly with blocky, which is quite common, it's depending on the size of the blocky structures, you may want to, if you say we're direct seeding something, you want to prepare a nice seed bed, you might want to add material to the top of the seed bed or do really, really shallow tillage, just crush up the very top inch. But as far as plant growth is concerned, it's a fine soil structure. There's cracks between the blocks, water can get in, roots can get in. Clay comes from soil abuse. Clay is like when you have like compaction for machinery and you get these pancakes happening in the soil, which is really bad for water infiltration and bad for your plants as well. So this is supposed to say bulk density, which is a quantitative measurement that kind of relates to texture and structure. So density, of course, is mass over volume. So you can easily go out and measure this by collecting a known volume of soil, drying it out, and then weighing it. And generally speaking, a lower bulk density is desirable because if you have a high bulk density, that's indicating compaction. And if you have a compacted soil, it becomes a bit repetitive at a certain point, but roots can't get in, water can't get in, there's not as much habitat for your beneficial soil microorganisms. Nutrients, I don't have time to meaningfully address this topic because it's really complicated. There are entire courses, entire degrees that you can take in nutrient management. But there are a couple points that I wanted to make as far as it's worthwhile to test your nutrients. It's worthwhile to see what's in there, but interpreting the results is not as simple as saying, okay, this is what's in the soil and this is what we need to add. Because there's a few other things you need to consider. One is your bioavailability to the plants that you're growing. So nutrients have different chemical forms that they can take in the soil. And some of those chemical forms are more water soluble and some are less. And some of them are more available to plants and some are less. A big factor influencing that is pH. So you can see here, the thickness of the bar is showing you how available, relatively speaking, each nutrient is at a given pH. And you can see there's pretty good availability across the board at between sort of 5.5 all the way up to 7, with a neutral to slightly acidic soil. So that's one of the reasons pH is important. Another thing to consider that I'll talk about a little bit more later is a healthy living soil that's full of beneficial microorganisms is going to allow plants to access more nutrients. So it's not just about what's in the soil, but it's about whether the plants can reach it and take it up. And then another thing to consider is balanced plant nutrition. So these barrels, I may not be able to read the text on there, unfortunately, but the idea is kind of to say each thing that your plant needs, whether it's light or heat or nitrogen or phosphorus, is like a slap on the barrel. And whatever is limiting is the thing that needs to be added. So let's say you have adequate heat, light, nutrients, water, nitrogen, potassium, but you don't have enough phosphorus. If you add more nitrogen, you're not really going to see a benefit because that's not the thing that's limiting the growth. So that's something to keep in mind, and it varies from plant to plant.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah, I think it's called Liebig's principle. But don't quote me on that.
Yeah, 'cause it's
I'm
basically
not entirely sure.
basically a leaky bear. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. Soil organisms. This is something that it's a really rapidly developing field in science, because soil organisms are sort of inherently difficult to study because they live in soil. They have these tiny little microhabitats in between the soil particles, and a lot of soil organisms are difficult to cultivate in a lab in a petri dish because it doesn't give them the conditions that they need. Now we have these new genetic tools, so we can take soil samples and sequence them and look at everything that's in them, but we're still figuring out what all of the different organisms do. I think when most farmers and gardeners think beneficial soil organisms, probably the first thing that comes to mind is earthworms. And earthworms are great. They create channels for roots and water to infiltrate. They help with nutrient cycling. They mix the litter on the surface layer of the soil into it so that it gets incorporated. Lots of benefits, but I wanted to highlight another important player in terms of beneficial soil organisms, which is mycorrhizal fungi. So mycorrhizal fungi are fungi that have a symbiotic relationship with plant roots. These can take lots of different shapes, but the basic principle of it is that the plants, they're photosynthetic, so they can create sugars and carbs from sunlight. But fungi are not photosynthetic. The fungi can link up with the plant roots. The plants provide the fungi with sugars and carbs, and in exchange, the fungi spread their thin filaments, mycelium, out into the soil, and they're able to access a lot more minerals and water than the plant roots can reach on their own, because in terms of like metabolic cost, in terms of like the energy required, mycelium, because they're so thin, they are a lot less expensive to produce than plant roots, and so they really extend the reach of the plant. So in this photo, this is the root, and then all the little white filaments branching out are the mycelium that is connected with the plant, and so they're allowing it to do to access a lot more in the same soil versus if the mycorrhizal fungi was not there. And there are bacteria that serve similar roles too. There are, when you think of, for example, legumes that fix nitrogen, it's not actually the plant that does it. It's the bacteria that associate with them and form these nodes and roots that fix the nitrogen. So yeah, soil organisms really critical to making your plants thrive. And then we have organic matter. So that is all the dead and decomposed plants, animals, whatever other organisms in the soil that give it that nice dark color from the carbon. And organic matter tends to be pretty nice and fluffy, so it tends to reduce bulk density, which is what we want. It tends to improve soil structure because if you have organic matter coating your mineral particles, you get that nice crumb structure that I mentioned earlier. And you're also providing food and habitat for soil organisms, and sometimes directly introducing soil organisms with the organic matter you're adding. Okay. So with all that in mind, talk a little bit about soil restoration. So all those different properties, structure, bulk density, organic matter, nutrients, a lot of them can be improved with a good quality compost. It's not a magic bullet, it's not the answer to everything, but it does cover a lot of bases. Because when you add a good quality compost, you're adding nutrients, soil organisms, and organic matter at the same time. And so that has the direct benefit of fertilizing, but you're also increasing your plant's ability to take up those nutrients, improving soil nutrient cycling and soil structure, and reducing bulk density. And all of that leads to not only healthy plants, but better resilience to extreme weather events like flood and drought. Because if you have a soil that is able to hold moisture, but also still have adequate drainage, if you find that happy medium, that sets you up to be able to cope with big fluctuations in the water going into your system. However, not all compost is created equal, because compost is a pretty broad term, right? Like it's just decomposed stuff that you're adding to your soil. So a few considerations with regards to compost. It could be made of all sorts of different things, right? Manure, yard trimmings, food scraps, biosolids, which is a euphemism for sewage. So you want to think about what's going into it. And then there are all sorts of quality tests that are done on compost if it's being sold commercially. So they look at trace elements, pathogens. Is the compost finished decomposing, or is it still actively rotting? So if you go to a garden center or to the regional district and you buy compost, it will very likely be, well, if it's the regional district, then is certified Class A or Category A. And what that guarantees is that it's basically that it's safe to use. It doesn't have fecal coliforms or any nasty pathogens, has safe levels of trace elements like heavy metals and micronutrients, and it's stable, so it's finished decomposing. Basically, you know you're gonna do more good than harm if you add a Class A compost. However, Class A compost can still vary widely in nutrient content depending on what it's made of. So you want to consider the application. And if you're using a compost that is made from mostly yard trimmings and wood chips, it'll be pretty low nutrient density. Still makes a great mulch, still adds organic matter and beneficial organisms to your soil, but it's not going to be nearly as high in nutrients as a compost made from, say, food scraps or manure. So that's something to consider.
Can I ask a question?
Oh yeah, sure.
Is it a concern to have too much woody material in compost? Like I noticed some compost from yard trimmings, it's mostly decomposed, but you can tell that there's still a lot of.
Yeah.
Does that will that be bad for the soil? Like, will that take away nutrients from the soil?
So it could potentially, if you have like a really high carbon to nitrogen ratio, because soil bacteria, they have sort of like an optimal carbon to nitrogen ratio range. And if there's too much carbon, basically it makes the nitrogen harder to take up. Okay. And so if you added a lot of really woody material, it may actually inhibit nutrient uptake.
Do you happen to know if that is a concern with the regional district compost, or?
I always thought that it was all yard trimmings and wood chips, but I was actually, as part of my new job as the compost coordinator, I was looking at their annual general report, and they actually put a significant amount of manure in.
Oh,
So I think it's actually more, it has more nutrients than I thought. Cause yeah, I was under the impression that it was just herb trimmings going in, but they actually accept, I think it's like 1,000 tons of manure per year.
From farmers, what?
Yeah,
Oh, I'm thinking.
So that's interesting because most farmers now use, going back to what Carl was saying, like in my experience, most farmers use wood chips. So that's,
bedding.
again, it's a lot of wood,
yeah.
right? So it's a lot of nitrogen, but it's also a lot of wood.
Now we're trying to set up a tour for next week so we can see the operation.
I'd love to see that.
Because that's one thing too that I want to ask them about is normally for Class A compost, it's regulated by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, which seems a little strange, but I guess they oversee it among many other things. But there's like very specific labeling requirements for Class A compost. But the regional district, I don't know if they're exempt because people are loading it directly into their vehicles and it's not packaged for retail sale in the garden center. But they don't have the guaranteed analysis that says, you know, this is your NPK, this is what's in it. Which I thought was mandatory if you're going to say it. I'm sure they have that information because they have to collect that data, but they don't publicize it. Yeah, I'm curious to know.
I thought they had two different types of compost. One that was mostly the trimmings and one that was mixed with the manure.
Oh,
That's what I understood.
Are we talking about like for that?
yeah,
I think it's called
Northern.
Yeah, because they do one, there's two different kinds. One is like double filtered. Versus
That's
that's
the sieving.
Mhm.
So that's another thing is like the particle size,
Mhm.
which again, depending on if you're mostly just trying to use it as a mulch and you have big chunks of wood in there, it's not a big deal. But if you want for a seed, then it's worth paying that extra sometimes to have them run it through a screen and sit and filter particles.
That's. Mhm.
I have another question with that is, so I worry with no-grow about pesticides, like I see what my neighbors use on their trees and lawns.
Yeah.
So does compost destroy that, or is it when it becomes part of it? Is it basically, from my point of view, contaminated?
So that's kind of an unknown, honestly, because in the compost regulations, they don't have to test for organic pollutants. So, which is what any herbicides and pesticides that they would be. Well, I guess they could, but commonly they'd be organic pollutants. So they're testing for heavy metals, pathogens. When they test if it's fully decomposed, they're testing to make sure that you're not going to have weed seeds germinating. But yeah, it depends on whether those compounds are degrading at the heat that the compost pile reaches, but it's not something that they're obligated to test for. So yeah, you just don't know, to be honest.
It's another one of those, unless you're making it yourself, you don't know what you're getting.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Interesting.
Yeah, because that stuff is definitely going in there. It's probably being broken down to an extent in those piles. They reach temperatures of at least 55 degrees Celsius generally. But that would be a great graduate study for
It
someone
would be, wouldn't it?
to see if there's well, I mean, glyphosate, which is the most common herbicide, like that doesn't persist for a long time, especially at high temperatures. That's why my master's supervisor, her primary area of research is looking at glyphosate in northern environments. Because of course, when they did those studies and say, look, it doesn't persist in the environment, that was all at more southerly latitudes. So part of what she's trying to do is say, maybe it's different in our context. But yeah, I think glyphosate would almost certainly degrade in those piles reaching those temperatures. But then yeah, people use all sorts of things. So there could be other stuff. You're allowed to use this compost in the certified organic system.
I know.
Yeah. But yeah, there could be traces of chemicals. And then few other principles. Soil, especially organic matter rich, healthy living topsoil is a very precious resource. So you want to protect it from losses due to wind and rain and overland flow. And the simplest way to do that is to avoid having bare soil as much as possible. So there's lots of different ways that you can do that. If you have a really quick crop like radishes or salad greens, once you pull it out, plant something else just to keep it covered. We can do mulch, cover crops, and then silage and landscape fabric are great tools too. They're relatively cheap and easy. It does mean more plastic. We make a lot of use of them at Three Seeds Farm right now. In the future, when we have more resources, we would like to move towards using more mulches instead. But for now, they're a very helpful tool for us. They also suppress the weeds. They're great to protect your soil and without tillage. Which moves me to another principle is avoiding disturbing the soil, because soil organisms organize themselves in a very particular way. They live at certain depths, certain pore sizes, and if you are constantly pulverizing your soil with machinery, it's not great for them. I understand from having been involved in farming that sometimes tillage is just a really useful tool that you can't avoid, but as much as possible, it's better to find other ways to manage. For example, if you want to fluff up the soil at planting time, you could consider using a broad fork instead of tillage. You could do just really, really shallow tillage. One thing that we tried this year that has it worked great. We had really nice seed beds was instead of tilling, so we have permanent beds where we actually do the planting, and then in between there are pathways where the soil is going to get compacted no matter what, because we're walking there. It's not really a space for growing things. So we had the pathways rototilled, and then we just scooped that loose material on top of the beds to make a nice loose seed bed without disturbing the soil underneath. And we're very happy with the results. And then consider planting perennials too, because once they're established, you really don't have to disturb the soil much at all. And then, of course, you've heard it before, crop diversity, crop rotation, making sure that you're not depleting the same nutrients and attracting the same pests year after year in the same spots.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah, sure.
Do you have an example of like a good, readily available mulch, like that works well, like
To suppress weeds or just to keep the soil covered?
like the general mulch to keep the soil covered to protect the topsoil essentially? Like, are leaves good or
Leaves tend to blow away.
okay, yeah,
Cardboard, unbleached cardboard,
okay,
wood chips. If you're not,
Grass?
yeah, grass trimmings.
It's the only reason I mow.
Yeah,
So that's actually, it was gonna be one of my questions, because that's my main mulch.
yeah.
I mow too much. That's it. That's the only reason I mow.
yeah.
So that's okay, because it's high in nitrogen, right?
Yeah.
And
I know that.
I've learned I don't want to put it on too thick, because then it kind of rots and it gets slimy and gross.
Yeah,
But a thin layer dries and gets absorbed into the soil quite quickly while it's still doing its job.
We've used hay, and it works really well to keep the soil, keep the weeds down, and keep the soil moist. The challenge is if it reseeds itself.
yeah.
So you can buy straw.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, sorry, that's what
Oh, okay.
straw. Sorry.
And I have had that happen with myself as well. Some straw was contaminated with seeds. And I have a bunch of hay growing in my garden. But I had good luck with it too.
Yeah, we grew corn last year, and it turned out really well.
Okay.
We put hay, straw down.
And that's relatively good too.
Yeah.
And it provides a little bit of insulation too.
Well, then with corn, sorry, I don't want to take over, but one of the things I've done with corn that I copied from indigenous people is the Three Sisters. I think
we
it
did that.
really does work. Like, I'm amazed by it. Like, basically the leaves of the
Yeah,
Squash.
squash, thank you, really do like shade the roots of the corn, which they like, and keeps the weeds down. Like it's amazing. I don't usually get much squash out of the deal, but that's okay. I just planted there to do that.
Functional.
sorry.
Oh no, I'm very happy for this to turn into a discussion.
We planted, with our corn, we planted sunflowers. And what we've learned is that sunflowers are an allelopath. And an allelopath, and they suck the nutrients from the plants that are around them.
Oh.
And so you have to be careful what the other plants are that you're wanting to grow in the garden with sunflowers, because they'll reduce the size and the lushness of the plants that are around it. So fortunately, the corn grew really well. The squash that we planted did not, and I made the mistake of planting bush beans, and I thought they were pole beans. So, but the beans grew fairly well. The squash did not. Yeah, so I would change that.
Yeah, and the beans, when you do their thing, they climb the corn. I just love it.
Is using wood chips as mulch a concern because of what we mentioned before, like the high carbon content? Like if it's just the top layer and you're mixing it in, sort of.
It's just on the surface. You don't have to worry much about it.
Okay.
Um,
And could you let it just slowly decompose into this? Or
Yeah,
would you want to like remove it at some point, or?
they don't break down very quickly. They're definitely, we've mostly on the farm, we've used wood chips in the pathways. We haven't really applied them to the active growing areas.
Yeah.
I'm sure you could try. One thing that we sort of like incidentally ended up experimenting with was so my master's research, I inoculated wood chips and 2 different types of straw with an edible mushroom wine caps. And then I was in Grand Prairie and Beaver Lodge for most of last year, but Jane and Roanne took the basically like the spent mushroom substrate, the hay and the wood chips that have been myceliated by Cassegraria or wine caps, and they spread it around, and what the mycelium does is it forms like a nice, it mats it together, which can be nice especially if the hay is or straw is really dry. It'll tend to blow away, so that gives you kind of a more dense ground cover, and then you also get mushrooms and grains, which is a bonus.
Interesting.
But yeah, it would accelerate the decomposition of the wood chips. If you were to do that with wood chips.
If you were to inoculate with mycelium.
Yeah.
Is that a thing that's commercially available? Like a spore spray or something where you could just like broadcast?
Those kind of products are out there. Yeah, there's a lot of, it's kind of a new and slightly unregulated market because there's all these like bio boost kind of products where they're like, oh, like inoculate your soil with this and that. And, like, it has all the beneficial microorganisms you need. But the thing is, like, soil microorganisms are so diverse, and they vary so much from region to region that if you have this commercial product that's made in one place and then you introduce it, a lot of the microbes might not survive necessarily. So that's something to be cautious of. But there's a couple species of white rot fungi that are pretty tough and can survive quite a wide range of conditions. Joshua, what's his last name? From PG Houseman?
Yeah.
From PG Urban Farmscape, he often gives away his spent mushroom substrate blocks, and those are a great thing to add to your garden.
It's next to the men's shed there.
Okay.
And I think there's definitely lots of places where you could order spore sprays or spore suspensions. I think Paul Stamets, kind of famous pop culture mycologist, he has a spore chainsaw oil, so that if you're cutting trees or cutting branches, the stumps get inoculated, which is kind of a neat thing. So yeah, those products are definitely out there. They're just kind of unregulated. So yeah, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. But there's
spores that actually live in chainsaw oil.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I mean, Same stuff.
I think I like what you said about not knowing what you're introducing into your local soil, or not knowing how a foreign organism will interact. Because if you think soil more like an ecosystem as opposed to a system of components, then you really want to think about interactions. And you think about kind of like the macro ecosystem we live in. You can't just, like, humans have done that so many times. We think, oh, this is a great organism. We're going to introduce it and we'll take care of this problem, and then it becomes a problem itself. Or so, yeah. That I just wanted to reflect that. I thought that was helpful to think about.
Yeah, I try to think of it more in terms of creating the habitat for the soil microorganisms to come in, because they're everywhere. You know, there's spores floating through the air. There's all these different beneficial organisms on the forest edge, and if you create a space that has the conditions that they need, they will eventually make their way in. Especially with the compost, like it has the decomposer organisms in it. And if the compost was made outside, then they've already kind of stood the test of the conditions that we'd be dealing with. Although the temperature of compost does go through, it goes through like a really hot phase with thermophilic bacteria and drops like that.
That's helpful to think about as well. Like, focus on building a healthy environment, and the organisms you want will, they'll flourish.
If you build it, chances are they'll come. Yeah, so this is my last slide of actual content. I think I just have a summary after this. I just wanted to talk about some soil properties that you can go and measure and observe yourself, and then a few that you have to send to the lab. And the great thing about soil is a lot of it you can do it yourself, and you don't really need anything super fancy. With the introduction to soil science students, we take them out to these soil pits just behind the school, and we are able to observe most of these things. That course is taught from more of a forestry perspective, so this is a little bit different. But if you look online, you can find a flow chart for hand texturing. So grab a handful of soil, wet it, and then it takes you through a couple different steps to estimate the clay content, basically. So can you roll it into a ball? Can you roll it into a worm? How long is the worm? Can you pinch it into a ribbon? And then based on that, you can actually pretty accurately place it. You won't know the exact percentages of sand, silt, and clay, but you can place it within that textural triangle and determine, okay, we have a clay loam, or we have a silty loam, or whatever it might be. Takes a little bit of practice, but it's fun to get to play with dirt. And then structure can also be observed in the field. So if you dig a little pit and then stick a trowel in it and just see the way that the soil falls off the wall of the pit, that'll give you a good indication of your soil structure. Bulk density, you can measure collecting a known volume of soil. If we were doing it in the lab, we'd dry it out in the oven, but you can find alternative means if you don't want to put it in your oven and then weigh it. And then you can compare it to other values, or compare different sites where you're working and see which areas are the most compacted. I didn't really talk about electrical conductivity, but often you can buy like a multimeter that measures both pH and EC. EC is related to salinity, which luckily not a huge issue around here, more so in the prairies. But yeah, pH, good thing to measure because it tells you if your nutrients are going to be available. This picture on top is showing a simple method to measure water infiltration rate. So you take a metal ring. You can use a measuring stick if you want to take detailed measurements, but you actually don't even need it. You just need a known volume of water and a stopwatch. So you pour it in and then you start the timer and you time how long it takes to make its way into the soil. And yeah, you can try it in different spots or the same place over time to see if the compost you're adding is working and improving your infiltration rate. I didn't talk about aggregate stability. That relates to soil structure, and vulnerability to erosion is sort of how well do your aggregates stick together in water. And there's a free app. We used it at the research farm when I was working there last year. And basically you collect some of the soil structures. The most common one is blocky. So you get some of those little blocks and you put them in a glass dish under a bright light, and then you position your phone above it, and this app will sort of analyze it for 10 minutes, and it'll measure the extent to which the structures spread out. And the better they hold together, basically, the more strongly structured your soil is. And if they tend to really just dissolve into nothing during that time, then it means you're more vulnerable to erosion. And then you can go out and look for signs of life in your soil. Look for earthworms, look for mycelium, insects, smell the soil, see if it has that nice rich earthy smell, which is a compound called geosmin that's responsible for that. It's produced by actinomycetes, which are bacteria that look like fungi. They form the same kind of thin filaments, but if you look at them on a cellular level, they're actually bacteria. But yeah, that smell tells you that they're there. And then there's a few things that you kind of have to send to the lab to figure out. I guess you could do organic matter content if you had like a flame torch, because I think the way they do it in the lab is organic matter will burn and the mineral particles won't. So they weigh the soil and then they burn off all the organic matter and they weigh it again. But that's probably easier just to have a lab do it. Nutrient content, good to have a lab do it. And then cation exchange capacity is basically, I wish I had a bag to look at this now, but it's on the surface of clays and organic matter. There are basically sites that cations, so positively charged nutrients, can latch onto or be exchanged. And when plants take up nutrients, they exchange some of their own hydrogen atoms or ions with the nutrients. And so cation exchange capacity, the simple explanation is that if you have high CEC, it means that you can retain more nutrients and your soil has better buffering capacity. So clay is actually good for that, but so is organic matter. So if you have a sandy soil and you add lots of compost, you can achieve a good CEC too. And there are lots of tests now for microorganisms, but again, going back to the whole focusing on building the habitat and the conditions for them, the tests tend to be difficult to interpret. So there's the sort of old school ways of testing where you look at the level of activity. So you can do carbon dioxide respiration or oxygen usage of the soil over a certain amount of time. But that's almost like, it'd be like if you went to a concert and you measured the decibel level of the band that was playing. Like it tells you the level of activity, it's like how loud they were, but it doesn't tell you anything about what's actually going on. So that's sort of a traditional method. And then the new methods involve genetics tools. And I'm dealing with one of those data sets right now. And they're tricky to interpret because you end up with a count of hundreds of different organisms that were in your soil, and then we don't know the ecology of all of them and what they do. But it's interesting, but not necessarily necessary, because if you're creating soil conditions, chances are you'll have good organisms. And that's my presentation for today. I have some, but I don't know if it's necessary. And this is a slime mold that was growing in my room. And yeah, I'm happy to chat.
Go ahead.
Are there fairly standard or straightforward ways to deal with each of the limitations in a given soil? Like I'm thinking about like soil texture, for example. Like if you've got like sandy, gravelly soil, if you've got like just like really clayey soil, how to approach a loam. Like, are there methods that are like pretty standard and tested and appropriate to use out there? Like, are there resources for that sort of stuff?
There's lots of resources. Texture is kind of the hardest thing to change
Okay,
because you kind of got what you got, short of importing a whole bunch of new material to your site.
right.
The nice thing is if you add enough organic matter, you kind of end up with a soil that the dominant properties come from the organic matter, and then it matters less what the mineral particles are
Right.
underneath. So yeah, compost is not always the solution, but often. The only thing to be careful, well, I guess there's a few things to be careful with compost. One thing I haven't mentioned is with regards to balanced nutrition. If you're adding compost from the same source year after year, you can actually have, if that compost is really rich in a particular nutrient, like manure is really rich in phosphorus, which tends to be, you can actually have like an unhealthy buildup of that because they're not always or they'll be in a form that's only slowly available to plants. And if they're not using it up every year and you're adding every year, then sometimes you actually can cause a problem that way. So that's one of the few caveats with compost. I don't know if there's not necessarily like a one size fits all solution, but there's definitely like there's lots of resources. Some general principles that apply in those situations.
Mhm.
So I've grown my entire life on clay, and the thing about organic matter and compost that blows me away is how it just vaporizes.
Oh,
It just disappears basically. Like it takes an enormous amount, like you can keep adding it. I mean, I value the clay, I value the nutrition, I value the fact that it keeps the moisture and all that. But yeah, literally, I just feel like it's this big hole that I pour compost in. And I have for 40 years. And, you know, it's quite different from the soil around it.
Yeah,
but it's
like
not
gardens.
anything like what you have at the community garden,
Mhm.
like, which is where it's
Like the stuff
with alone.
in the raised beds or the
Well, the Queensway Community Garden is, it's like, I guess, river loam would be a great description. It's just beautiful soil to grow in.
Kind of what you're growing in now at Darren's farm.
and the river recharges it too. You have the periodic flooding and it brings a bunch of nutrients up onto shore. Added benefit. Yeah, it's nice in the river.
The land in question, and you know, I'm sure you know this already, but it's built
Yeah,
over
Yeah,
5
that's
acres to raise it above the floodplain. So, and I don't know what the composition of that bill is.
and it came from a construction project, right?
The
Gateway. I mean, we've never really even dug in there to check.
No, you can go and hand texture it.
Yeah, good.
But it has been grass for, well, I don't know when it was built, but
Not that long ago, you would know, I think, because you were involved in that project before. Do you know when they filled it?
Well, before my time, before 7 years. So
Okay.
it's always been grass. Feels like.
grass for, which I think is good for building soil.
Yeah, the roots decompose and
Yeah.
they add organic matter over time. And they also hold it together. They protect it from being eroded. I wonder.
At first, when we got involved, I just thought, I'm not even worried about what it is because we can just build beds, right? But then that involves making a lot of compost, right? Or buying a lot of soil to bring it there. Yeah.
I remember in earth science, we talk about the geological history of this area. And so the whole bowl used to be a glacial lake.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of the bowl is clay because it was lake bottom. And then on top of University Hill, it's till, so it's a lot more gravel there. And then somewhere at some point on the hill where the lake edge used to be, there's kind of like a sandbar. That used to be the beach of Glacial Lake George.
I know down by, like in your neighborhood, I have friends who live there and they say it's like in the Miller Edition, their yard is.
And you know, I don't know because our yard was so modified by the previous one owners who were landscapers, but I have no idea. Actually, most of it is landscape fabric, and then it has soil added on top of it. So I don't
Yeah.
know. I thought it was loam. I thought it was that it was actually really well drained because the water doesn't sit, like it just disappears. So I mean, some of it you just observe, like you are saying, right? Like I've never seen a puddle.
Right. Right.
And there has been lots of opportunity for puddles recently.
Yeah.
So it's well drained.
Mhm. Well, thank you for your presentation. This has been wonderful.
It's like,
So interesting.
I want 1 or 2 now. Maybe you could have the next one at the land.
Yeah.
Like
Well,
hands on.
we'll have a field day and then we can go out and collect some of this information.
Mhm.
That would be so cool, like to, yeah. And then to have kind of like some context to discuss these things in. What is the texture?
I had no idea that there was electricity involved in the uptake of nutrition, of nutrients. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it's funny because I've talked about it so many times in terms of electrical charge, but the idea I think of it as electricity is, I don't know, it takes it to another level, but it
Well, it's like the
is.
human body. As you
Yeah.
were talking, I was thinking it really is like the human body. Like
Yeah.
now we're really talking about like for gut microbiome, which we weren't talking about 10 years ago, right? And
Yeah.
now we're like, it's being called the second brain. So it's a little bit like that. There's all this stuff we don't understand. It's a lot more complicated than the base.
Electroculture this year. Like it's got a bunch of copper wire from vibration wire and I just wrapped it up and then put it in the soil in a couple of different places around the garden.
Is it, what is it supposed to do?
It just makes it, yeah, attracts more energy
Mm-hmm.
to the soil. Yeah.
So when there are lightning storms, does that supercharge the mycelial layer? That's what I've been reading, or I've been hearing.
I don't actually know anything about that.
Oh, okay.
I know that mycelium do use electrical impulses to regulate. But I'm not sure how lightning affects it. That's an interesting question.
I guess I think about the smell after rain and especially after lightning storm. Just it's, maybe I'm being a little bit out there, but I think that it's it smells very life-giving. If
Yeah,
that makes sense. Yeah.
I think a lot of the smell after the rain is that compound I mentioned earlier, the geosmin. That when the soil gets re-wetted, especially if it's been sort of dry for a while and then it rains suddenly, the actinomycetes become active again and they release geosmin.
So what's that word again? Geosmin.
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 SMYN.
SMIN.
Geosmin.
Yeah.
That's
I
the
think-
smell of your face. That's
Yeah.
lovely.
I mean, it's probably more complicated than that.
Yeah.
There's probably multiple
Oh, yeah.
compounds, but that's like the most recognized.
That's the main note.
Yeah.
From a perfume point of view.
Yeah.
My sunroom smells like that way.
I would love to keep talking about soil all night. But I just
Okay,
want to
so
get a little time. It's 10 after 7.
thank you.
Uh,
Thanks for keeping us.
So-
20 minutes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Keith.